All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey. This is Yoga Framework. And every week I teach you how to create a better yoga and mobility practice. Thanks for joining me on the live stream today. If you're here, obviously, I'm not going to, whatever. I just want to talk a little bit about the products first. Before we start, I got a great stream planned for you today. We're going to be talking about palmar flexion. We're going to be talking about the wrist and how to move through different articulations and how it works and all this great stuff. First, let's go over the book. Reset, Mulligan. So I want to talk about the book. The book is a course book that covers yoga, and I'm so excited to be offering this book. There is no other kind of technical book that I've come across that encompasses all this, but without going too much into detail, it's a great book for learning yoga. It's not the philosophy. It's more about the nuts and bolts. You can pair it with any training, and I don't know. It's really a great piece of material that I've worked hard to offer. In addition, we have the cards. I just want to say that the cards are a product that allows for sequencing. It's a fun little tool. It's also advanced. It pairs with the book, so. As well as it being like kind of a toy and fun to use, it's also really in depth. It teaches you sequencing. I have all the major sequences in there, one of which we'll be talking about today. Okay, so I kind of let the cat out of the bag in the beginning. My bad. But let's get started with the pop quiz. The question of the day is, how do you flex your wrists? So that's the question. You got 1 minute to answer it. And it's not wrist flexion. That's not the answer. So that's the pop quiz. While we're here, today's episode is about weight bearing in the hands. Right? We're going to go over different techniques and how that all plays together. This is one of the major, let's say, hindrances in yoga, I feel, because we do so many movements on the hands. So, all right, you got 20 seconds left. How do you flex the wrist? And that's the real question here. Like I said, I hope I didn't spoil it. And the answer is palmar flexion. Of course, I said that starting out. This is what the stream is about. It's about palmar flexion. Now, I also would have accepted this. So the idea of flexing your palm, if you're not sure what that is, because this is what palmar flexion is. A lot of people actually don't understand or don't even know what palmar flexion is. I didn't know what palmar flexion is. That's why it's so important, and I want to go over it. But to keep it in layman's terms, it's the movement this way, right? This is dorsiflexion, palmar flexion. Okay, great. So an example, well, let's move on. Let's just go to the schedule. Let me show you what we have in store today. Okay, we're going to start out. I'm going to talk a little bit more about palmar flexion and how important that is and all that stuff. And then we're going to get into like something I call the Q myth, which is obviously related to today's topic. Then we're going to go through a pose breakdown, which is going to be fun because I'm going to really outline one of the major poses. I'm not going to give it away. And then we're going to go into sequences and patterns, and I'm going to put that pose together with a sequence. I'm going to show you how it works, and we're going to test it all out. And all that's going to be done, right, over at the studio. So it's actually that way. But that's the studio that I'm going to be showing you all the moves in, if you were curious. So let's talk a little bit more about palmar flexion and the idea and what that is and how that all works. So I like to think of it as one of the bandhas, which I'll be doing another, obviously a segment on bandhas and stuff. But I like to think of hasta bandha, which is bandha is just a lock. Hand is hasta, so hasta bandha is hand lock. And what I like to think about is the idea of creating tension or an isometric. I think about the feet a lot because we're constantly weight bearing in the feet. And then you come into yoga, right? You don't really weight bear in the hands unless you're a professional hand balancer from like a young age, or maybe you're in the circus. It's rare. So you come into yoga and then we're immediately like, this is a great rehabilitation. Now do half the class on your hands. And for a lot of people, there's so much, I don't know, they're just, they just don't understand. There's not enough knowledge, let's say, to how to do this and what the joint is doing and so forth. So this is where palmar flexion all comes in. And when we talk about the feet, we have to think of what is the ankle doing, right? Because the wrist is very comparable to the ankle. So when we take a step forward and we walk, the foot in the back that's bearing weight, right? One step forward, the other foot that is in the back is actually pushing into the earth, right? To propel us forward. And that's done using the calf muscle. So when you think about walking, right, you're pushing, the ankle is pushing into the floor and it's propelling you forward using the calf muscle. Now I want you to take your hand, make a fist, and instead of making the traditional muscle where you flex your bicep, I want you to palmar flex your wrist. And you can do it with either arm. And what you might feel is like a little bit of a tension down here. Now it might be soft here, right? You can see I do a lot of palmar flexion. And I have this muscle here. And that's from hand balancing and all that different, all those different moves on the floor. Now, when you make it, maybe it's, it's soft and it's not as strong as you want, or maybe it is strong and you're like, wow, I have great wrist flexion, which is palmar flexion, really. That's the palm flex, so palm side moving down. This is like your calf muscle. So in order to have power in flexing your palm, you're going to need to have power in the forearm. The carpal tunnel is a tunnel in your wrist, like a kind of like a hole, and allows all the muscles to run through it. They connect up here. This is, you don't have a carpal tunnel, or it is similar. They're similar bone structure. I'm not positive, but the muscles, right, from the feet are running all the way up to the calf, and that's a very similar concept here. So this is like your calf. This is where the power is. When you flex down, right, you should be able to create that power there. And that's what palmar flexion is in a nutshell. So when I say Hasta Bandha hand lock, what I want to do is I want to create that same concept that happens when I'm walking. So when it's in the foot, it's called plantar flexion. And when you push the floor away, you're plantar flexing. You're already, right, in ankle dorsiflexion, right? So the earth is pushing your ankle down and you're flexing away. This is no different in your hands. You're going to bear weight in the hands. The earth is pushing you into wrist dorsiflexion. You're going to need to move forward and flex against that palmar flex to create the isometric. Now the isometric is where you're going to find the power, right? And all the propelling or resistance, whatever you want to call it. All right, so that's the palmar flexion. It sounds simple, hard to execute. We're going to go over some drills. I'm going to show you how it works in specifically with some yoga stuff, but this is hand balance 101, right? Hand weight bearing in general. You don't want to jam into the wrist, just like you wouldn't want to jam into the heel of your foot. All right, let's move on to the next segment, the cue myth. This week's myth. What is the cue? Shoulders over wrists. This is a cue that I hear all the time, or I've heard in the past many times. And what it's telling you to do is to align the shoulder, right, over the wrist. Seems pretty good, right? So maybe this is a good cue, but it might, it is a good cue for certain poses. It's not a good cue for all poses. That's the problem. So let's go into the breakdown. How it works. It really works for mostly straight arms. Because if you have shoulders over wrists, right, that's where you're going to keep that alignment, and you're going to keep it nice and, or at least the beginning of the alignment to create and lean and palmar flexion, because it's obviously much more complex than just putting your shoulder over wrist, which is one of the other options, one of the other answers they're saying it's vague. It's really vague. So it's not just it's really not a great cue overall. And it allows compensation because there's a joint in the middle. So if I keep my shoulders over my wrist and bend my elbow, right, I can still keep my shoulder over my wrist as I bend the elbow. And that's going to create an interesting angle on my elbow. Maybe that's not what I want. Maybe it is what I want. It's not that you can't do it. You're very dynamic. You just want to be careful what you're doing, and you want to understand why you're doing it and which movements you might need now or might not need right now because of overuse or underuse, or you name it. You're really complex. You're a fine-tuned machine. So shoulders over wrists, it's not the best cue. You know what? It's not it's an okay cue for some poses, but really it's not the best cue. I would refrain from using it. What can you say instead, right? I don't want to just be like, don't use this cue. I want to give you something you can use instead. Elbows over wrists. And this is much more ideal because there's no joint in the middle. So if I'm going to go into plank, I could say elbows over wrists, right? That's the same thing as shoulders over wrists. And it'll take away from the compensation of people bending their arm, letting the elbow move back, or changing the orientation of the weight in the hand. The starting point, let's say, not the full hand, just the starting point in the hand. All right, so I hope this kind of made sense. It's not the worst cue. It's good for plank. It's good for poses where the arm is straight and you're doing some weight bearing. Other than that, I might move away. And if you want to just erase it all together, use elbow over wrist and get used to using that instead. All this, by the way, is in the book. This is why I love the book, and I'm plugging it so much, is because it's all in the book. I really couldn't find a better resource. This is why we put it together, or I put it together with, some help from my colleagues and partners, which one day we'll have on the show soon. But know that you can read this, you can catch up, you can do these live streams and the videos that we provide. Same thing, you can learn. And the cards, like I said, they go along with it. So check them out, yogaframework.com. We also have classes on there if you want to take my class or others. All right, let's move on. What do we got next? Pose breakdown. Okay, so what pose are we going to do today? I didn't want to give it away before, but today we're going to be going over Chaturanga Dandasana, if you want to say the full version. Basically, low plank pose. This is one of the most crucial, injury-prone, popular poses in yoga, right? Chaturanga is like it. Everyone's like, that's your strength pose, that's Chaturanga. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I will go over Chaturanga. I will break it down. I will explain why it's so difficult, and I'll explain how to use palmar flexion, how to do it correctly, how to create those moves. All right, so what is involved in doing Chaturanga pose? What are the articulations? All right, so it's a lot. Chaturanga is really intense. There's a lot going on in the body. First, we have palmar flexion, right? You're going to resist because you're going to be moving forward in Chaturanga, right? And that's going to take away from that compensation of the elbows moving back, which we'll get into on the demo. There's also a scapula protraction. That's this rounding of the upper back, pulling the shoulder blades, the scapula apart. That creates a nice, powerful position. Commonly, people might retract in this position, which takes away from that power. So you want to build power in that shell. It's like you're pushing, like your back is up against the wall and you're just pushing something away. That's an analogy. Elbow flexion, but an isometric elbow flexion, because in yoga, we're going to go full range, but in yoga, we are looking for that 90-degree angle. So that's that isometric. Knee and hip extension. This is in unison. You're going to extend the knee and the hip. You're going to keep them both going. and plantar flexion, which is also not so commonly known. This has a lot to do with rolling the toes because you have to find a way to get forward before you come to the floor. And it's not, you know, what you see in yoga is people flipping the toes a lot, and that's that mid part. What we're going to do is we're going to show you why chaturanga involves plantar flexion, and then why and how that leads into the next pose. All right, so that's basically it. Chaturanga Dandasana, the articulations: palmar flexion, scapular protraction, elbow flexion, but an isometric, right? Because you're at 90 or, you know, close to that, at least holding it for the pose. Knee and hip extension, and then plantar flexion. All right, so let's go over the studio. Oh wait, let's go over the sequence and pattern first, because that's basically how I'm going to break it down. So the sequence is the quarter vinyasa. That's what I like to call it. Technically, there is only a full vinyasa and a half vinyasa. This is coming right from Ashtanga Vinyasa. But the quarter vinyasa is really what most of us are doing. A half vinyasa has to do, and a half and a full vinyasa, they have to do with the jump through. And the half vinyasa has a jump through in some other poses. The full vinyasa has the jump through and parts of Surya Namaskar A. So, or it is kind of Surya Namaskar A in there. But that's a whole nother lesson on Surya Namaskar that we'll go over one day. Just know that this is an abbreviated version of that. I call it the quarter vinyasa sequence. Again, it's in the book. It's all in the book. It's like a teacher training in a box. Okay. What is the pose order, or what are the poses? Plank, chaturanga, low plank, upward dog, and downward dog. That's it, right? People say it all the time. Take a vinyasa. And when they say take a vinyasa, this is what they mean. Going through this: plank, chaturanga, upward dog, downward dog. So I'm going to show chaturanga, and I'm going to show how it's linked within this quarter vinyasa sequence. Pretty much the foundation of everything we do in yoga, or at least a lot of what the traditional sequencing or classical sequencing, whatever you want to call it, is showing us. Not that it is the correct and only way, all right? Obviously, you know I'm not that guy, and we're not that channel. All right, so let's go over the studio. Let's get started. All right, I'm gonna disappear over here. I'm gonna go over there. Oh, there we go. Saw me taking that drink, huh? I was supposed to edit that out. Oh well. Okay, here we are over at the studio. Welcome to my studio, or welcome to Yoga Framework, the studio. Today, we're going over plank and chaturanga, upward dog and downward dog. That's the sequence. I'm gonna cover palmar flexion and all that stuff right now so you can get an understanding. Very simply, or simply put, take your arms out, protract like you were in plank, and then add palmar flexion, pushing down. That's it. Right there, you're doing it. But what's going to happen is the floor is going to be under your hands. So when you push, you're not going to go anywhere. That's going to create an isometric. Just like my feet, right? So I'm standing, I was saying this before. When I walk, right, there's a push in the back foot. Or we can think of it like when I lean, because now that you can see I'm leaning, and this is more similar to that. And I can mimic what my feet are doing, right? They're resisting, they're pushing into the floor. And my hands are just mimicking the ankles movement here. And play with this drill. See if you can feel the ankles kicking in to plantar flex, and then try to palmar flex in unison with that to understand how to resist gravity, right? You're trying to resist falling forward. Just like you don't want to fall forward on your face here, you don't want to fall forward on your face here. Let's take it further. Come into a hands and knees position. Now this is probably where you're going to want to start. It's going to be hands and knees to the floor. If you can't do this, you're not ready for chaturanga. And you should be doing this one instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with like almost a back bend a little bit. I'm going to let my hips come down first. I'm going to see if I can lower all the way to the ground. Notice my elbows. They're kind of at 90 because I came forward. I observed the sacred geometry. And then I'll come back. All right, I want to make sure that I have a hands and knees position that makes sense. Look for 90-degree angles or close to that behind the wrist and in front of the knee. And then from there, you don't move the knees. You don't slide anything. You follow the geometry. Palmar flex. Oh, so hard, like crazy. And see how the heel of my hand is lifted now? Because I'm so far forward that I'm actually kind of palmar flexing against that. And I would need that to come back. This is like your feet doing this, right? You come too far forward, the heels lift. Same thing in your hands. If you come too far forward, the heels should lift, right? So you don't want to be in a habit of doing this and lifting the fingers. You actually want to be in a habit of doing this and lifting the palms. And this is tough. This is palmar flexion. Let's make it even simpler. Right, hands flat, try to lift. See if you can flex a little bit against the floor. Or even push full extension of the fingers. Right, so the hands are flat and you're creating it on a bigger level. These are all already taxing my wrists. And just that movement of hands and knees to the floor is a lot. One more time, hands and knees position, 90-degree angle behind your wrist and in front of the knee, and then slowly lower. Don't move the hands or the knees, and you should be in pretty much the floor position as you would for low plank or chaturanga. All right, let's take it further, and let's come into plank position. Toes are flat, protract the scapula, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into plantar flexion. Now I'm already in palmar flexion at the same time. And then slowly with shoulder protraction, isometrically find the elbows, really tough. And then lower to the floor. Landing in that same position, notice my feet are on, they're palmar flex basically, plantar flex basically. I'm on the tops of the feet. I can push right back to hands and knees. All these positions geometrically, sacred geometry, let's say, makes sense. You should be able to match them up. And this is the same for the whole sequence, right? We'll start in downward, we'll start in plank. I'll go to the floor, forward, land in kind of like a beginning Cobra position. Then come into upward dog, back to downward dog. So starting in plank, toes flat, palmar flexion and plantar flexion. Elbow bends to 90, isometric. Shoulder protraction. Eventually coming to the ground. Heels of the hand might be lifted. Now when I come into Cobra though, notice the heel of the hand comes down, especially in upward dog. Still palmar flexing. Rolling the toes, downward facing dog. That is intense, by the way. So I'm going to take a quick break before I do it again, because I want to make sure it's done right. We'll go over what's happening. Shoulder protraction. Palmar flexion against the floor, right? The isometric. While I'm coming forward over the toes, that's plantar flexion with palmar flexion to create that forward movement, intensely resisting in the wrists. Like I said, if you cannot do hands and knees to the floor, where you have a 90-degree angle behind both, see how I land with the heel of my hand lifted? You're not ready for chaturanga. And that's okay, because maybe you've been doing it wrong forever. I'm not saying you have, but just something to think about. This is the way that I've seen it in the books, right? The literature. This is the most powerful and the geometric way you can do it. All right, one more time. Protraction in the scapula. Toes flat. Tippy toes, right? Palmar flexion, plantar flexion. Bend the elbow 90-degree isometric. Rolling the toes all the way down. All right, Cobra into upward dog. Still palmar flexing, rolling the toes to downward dog. And maybe I have a nice bend in the knee and working that loaded stretch in downward facing dog. Another discussion for another day. All right, so I hope you're kind of getting what I'm talking about, how important palmar flexion is in your practice. It's something that, to be honest, I don't know how we can incorporate it more, but it's something we need to talk about more as teachers. It's something you have to understand as a student. And, maybe we can relate it to Hasta Bandha, like I did in the book, or the concepts, right? We can start to create that synergy. Maybe that's a better way to think of it. All right. Let me join you back. All right, we're back. I hope you enjoyed what we went over there, right? Today, we've been going over palmar flexion, just to review. We went over chaturanga and the pose and the sequences. The cue, right? The cue myth, that was shoulders over wrists. Like I said, instead, you can do something like elbows over wrists. That should be a much better way to think about it. And again, all this information is in the book. You can order this book on yogaframework.com. It's also on amazon.com. It's not a book about yoga. It's not a book well, it is a book about yoga, but it's not a book about yoga philosophy. It's not a book about me. It's a book about movement philosophy as that pertains to the yoga, the classics. We follow the ideals. And at the same time, one more time, the cards, check them out if you want a great companion for the book. My name's Jeffrey. This is Yoga Framework. I just want to thank you for joining me today. And every week I teach you how to create a better yoga and mobility practice. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next week.